we're here with Larry Kraft and his photographs. Can you please tell me what this picture is about?
Well, I think this is my great-grandfather, Michael Singer. My mother had it and is one of her prized possessions. And she told me one time what it was, but I didn't care, of course, as kids don't. But he looks much like my grandfather, Lawrence, who would have been his son. In fact, this is the next picture. This is my grandfather, Lawrence. And this is my mother's family. This is my mother. There were 8 children. There was another daughter born after this one. His name was Lorenz, and they named me after him. My given name is Lawrence. I had it changed to Larry because all of my record school and otherwise Larry, so it caused a lot of confusions with things like licenses and the like. There's another person that whose name you might recognize, who was named after that person as well, and his name is Lawrence Singer. I mean, Lawrence Welk, the famous, and that was one of my mother's favorite relatives, of course, especially the more famous he got. But I was born in Strasbourg in 1937, probably less than 2 miles from where Lawrence Welk was born. And I was born in this trailer, who my parents later sold to my Uncle Bill. This is my Uncle Bill. I was born at home in a single bed that, for what it's worth, I slept on for the next many, many years. I had it all the way through high school. It followed me wherever I went.
Now, was there a midwife present for your birth?
I don't think so. Well, it's possible there was even a doctor. I'm not even certain of that. I just know that that's where I was born and that it was at home. And she was never angry with me because of it, so I must not have been a terrible kid to give birth to. And then this is me in Strasbourg. This is, I think, next door to the house my father built in his evenings and weekends. He tore down an old barn and built a little house in Strasbourg where we lived for not a long time before we had to move to a farm to keep Dad out of the service. This is World War II, and he, in addition to being a parent, he was going to be a farmer. This is, I believe, the farm we first moved to. There's a notation that says 1942. I'm not sure that it was 42. That doesn't seem right, just from a chronological perspective, but it was a really bad place to live. They had no facilities of any kind, very, very primitive everything. There were cattle, I remember this about it, there were cattle all around and not much of a fence. And one of my sisters, I believe it was Bev, crawled under the fence and got chased by some cattle, or almost did. My mother had one of her infamous events over it, but she came out of it all right. So I think it could have been Margie because she seemed a little young. One of my big memories of this place is this yard and a blanket. My father bought a gallon of Mogan David wine for the threshing crew, which came around, which was how they did their crops. And I got into it, and I got violently ill. And my mother took me out to the yard and let me recover on a blanket. She fed me pickles, I recall, and it was really a very uncomfortable time in my life. It makes a guy think about swearing off drinking, as a matter of fact. these are a little out of sequence, like I said. After this farm, we moved to what was then my grandfather Kraft's farm in near Kintyre, and we were there for a few years. This community was at the time just strictly German. There was no other language spoken. I could not speak English. My sister went to a grade school there. I was too young to go to school yet, but she took me to school with her a couple of times, and the teacher took a liking to me. So I would go to school with her, and I'd sit on the teacher's lap during the lessons, and learn a little English there because she was teaching English. And then after this, we moved to Lemoore. I knew a few words in English, but for all practical purposes, when I started the first grade, I was unable to speak English. And that first grade was in a country school. There were 8 grades, and a wonderful place for a kid who couldn't speak English, because I had a whole lot of, well, there were 16 kids, and they were all brothers and sisters for all practical purposes. And there was just no problem with the language. Everybody worked at making sure that I didn't get in trouble because I was speaking German. And by the time I was in the second grade, they tell me my accent was gone. Although the bad part about that was I also stopped speaking German. I always listened and I understood. My folks spoke German at home and at all family events, there were always weddings and the like to go to back over out west. The folks called it, that was Strasbourg. Everybody spoke German, and I listened, but I gradually lost all ability to speak German, which I guess can be considered not good. This is the school I was just talking about that I went to. This is my infamous hat that had goggles. I'll never forget the goggles. They didn't last. They broke. And I had a little problem with this hat. I took 2 barrels and put them on top of each other on this very flat surface out there in the farm so I could get up a little higher. And the bottom one slipped out, and I hit the side of my head on the bottom barrel and got a big gash, and I just put the hat back over so that my mother wouldn't see it. And of course the blood gave me away. But I loved that hat. These are all homemade clothes. I can't imagine that, well, this might not have been. When it looks at it, was a hand-me-down. But I'm sure Mother made these clothes. We had a really tough time because my mother did bake our bread, and so we'd go to school and we had this homemade bread with peanut butter and all of the other kids had Wonder Bread, and all this really fine, nice white bread, and we were forced to eat this awful stuff that my mother made, which was not so awful. All right, these are the girls, all the girls that were at the school at the time. My sister Dorothy, my sister Marge, my girlfriend Ginny, the smartest girls in school after my sister Dorothy, who in those days they would take a state test when they graduated from the 8th grade, and my sister Dorothy got the highest grade on the test in a region. And she, the superintendent of schools for the region started at Linton and went all the way through Oaks and Lemoore. And so the superintendent took her to the state capitol to address the legislature, which was just a marvelous thing for her. And she got sick on the way, and barfed all over her new dress. And this is her story, but she went on anyway, and it worked out all right. But she had moving to town, we moved to town when, after my fourth grade. She would have been in I started the fifth, I believe. I might have a year or two off, but she started high school there, and she had a harder time adjusting from the grade school where she was the number one student and the pride and joy of the teacher to this high school. And this is really unfortunate because she's as bright as a person as I know. She dropped out of high school as a sophomore, and a real waste from that perspective.
Now, you had mentioned that it was really a hard story about your parents moving to be close to a school.
Well, yeah, they moved from the farm. They moved to the farm that I showed you the pictures of, to farm. It was a nice farm, and my uncle John, who lived just my mother's brother, lived a few miles west, found it for him and set him up, and for all practical purposes. But when we were going through school, they made the big sacrifice leaving the farm to move to Lemoore so that we could go to school. I mean, we did really well in school, and it was it just seemed like it was a very important thing to do. So this is the grade school. These are the girls. My folks moved to Lemoore when I was in the fourth grade. I think I started the fifth grade there. I know I did the fifth grade, and so that's the time. My father worked whatever jobs he could find to support us. He took a part-time job as a clerk in a grocery store, stocking shelves. That's my father there in this grocery store, stocking shelves, and he gradually learned a little about the business, and a very sharp man. He was uneducated, which is not the same as saying he was stupid, and he had great math skills, although he never took any math. He just came home one night and said to my mother, "You know, that's not such a hard thing to do, and there's a little store for sale, let's buy it." So he went into the grocery business in Lemoore. In this little store, it would have fit in this room right here. There was just a hole in the wall. And a funny story is because a couple of the other stores, the managers we heard were at one of the local bars talking about how they would give him 6 months and he'd be out of business, and he buried both of them. And just hard work. He just never ever didn't work. The only time we ever took a family vacation or a vacation that included him was in 1948. This is our 47 new after World War II car. First model that Ford produced after the war. Looks like the 42 or 41, if you remember or 40, whatever those years were. We went up to Garrison Dam. It was under construction or had just completed, so it was 1948, I believe. And it was a 2-day trip, and that was it. The only other vacation I remember the man taking, he might have taken a couple of days to go to a wedding in Strasbourg, but that's it, was when I was a sophomore in high school and my sister Marge was a freshman. He and my mother went to California for 2 weeks, and Margie and I ran the store, which is an indication of the kind of responsibility that Germans from Russia, kids, just had to work. And there was, I don't think it hurt anybody, but we had to work. I see these kids walking around our neighborhood now who are 9th graders and 10th graders, and I'm wondering, could any of them run a store for 2 weeks? The last thing my father said before he left, he says, now some of these salesmen, they're going to try to sell you some things you don't need, so you be careful. And so the cookie salesman comes to town, and he goes to our cookie area, major part of the middle of the store, and he says, well, you're going to need this and you're going to need that. He's got this whole list, and pretty soon I think this guy's making taking advantage of me, and I said, no, I don't want anything. So, you're sure? Yeah, I don't want anything. So he left. They only came every few weeks. The next time he came, I think we had sugar cookies left in the cookie thing, because that was a mistake that I will never forget. But we ran it for 2 weeks, and it was no big deal. Well, that's my father working for the city. He cleaned the streets. This was before he had his store. Okay, well, this is my grandmother Kraft, taken in the 80s. She was in an old people's home, and I guess that's the wrong word, assisted living home in Strasbourg. Very, very generous, wonderful woman. She never learned to speak English, although she understood everything, and gave birth to 17 children. One died at age 2 or so. 17 lived. My father was number 2 of the 17. Died, I think, in 1986 or so. I'm not certain where.
Did you spend a lot of time with her when you
No,
were growing up?
no, very little, because we moved from the area. It was just the only time I saw her would be family events, and the traditions of the old country were carried on by the people in Strasbourg. So when somebody got married, we're talking about a party that lasted and lasted, and we would go to Strasbourg for those wedding parties that were called. And then I'd see my grandmother, all my relatives. It was a time for relatives, and she was always there, always smiling. Very nice person. But I always say that had my grandfather not died, there probably would have been 20 kids, because she was a very, very healthy person who would have. That's a picture of the confirmation, I believe. All dressed up in white, and my parents were my grandmother Kraft, the picture I just showed you, was just so dedicated to the Catholic Church. She went to Mass every day in Strasbourg. She would walk to Mass every single day, and had no time for anything but people who really believed. And my Uncle Pete, my father's older brother, number 1, married outside the church, and for all practical purposes, I think he was excommunicated by her. But she never really, she just never thought much of him after that, although she didn't, she associated with him. So anyway, I went through all of the motions. I went through the nuns would come to Berlin for 2 weeks every summer, and this is my first communion picture. That is, I am standing right here.
You said you had to go to classes for
for 2 weeks. School gets out, and a lot of work to do on the farm, but no, I got to go to catechism for 2 weeks. And I didn't mind it. It was not that big a deal. It's just that I didn't want to be in school some more. So I did it. As a matter of fact, at that age, I probably was thinking I was going to be a priest when I grew up, which is really kind of humorous now.
Were the classes in English or?
English, yeah. After we left Strasbourg and moved to Lemoore County, there was no German for me anymore. That was history. In fact, we were in a minority, and this is fresh out of World War II, and people were still not that nice to Germans. So, very oddly enough, an awful lot of the Germans from Russia would pass themselves off as Germans or as Russians, because they didn't want to be known as Germans during the war and after. I have some memories of the war, World War II. Not a lot, but I remember my Uncle Bill after the attack in Pearl Harbor. He joined the Navy, and I remember a send-off for him at our place. And I remember herding cattle out in the field with my sister Dorothy, who was 3 years older than I was, and I think I was probably 5, maybe 4. And 3 airplanes flew overhead, and she told me that those were the Japs coming to bomb us. And I never told me otherwise either, as I recall. So that World War II, I remember it ending. That was much older then, of course. Born in '37, so I was old enough to appreciate us finally getting out of it. As a matter of fact, we barely got out of it, and it seemed like finally we could live. And then we got into Korea. It just didn't seem possible that we were at war again, and there we were. All right, well, I'm straying. The farm, school. We lived 2.5 miles from school, a half a mile off the road, Highway 13. My father would, in the wintertime, when the weather wasn't real good, he would take us. And usually he would take us in the morning after chores. Chores consisted of in his case, milking by hand 23, 22 cows, morning and evening. And it was not unusual for the older kids, that included me, to milk a couple of cows before school. And of course there were the pigs to feed and the chicken, and there were lots of things to do before we could go to school. We missed a lot of school, a lot more than you would like, and there were times we'd be late. We had one cow that had only 3 teats, and I was assigned to milk her because it was the slowest. My father could do double duty with all the cows. I got the 3-teated one because I was pretty slow. We did not have running water. We did not have electricity. In fact, the water we had was a really bad situation. They had to drill many, many feet into the ground to get water, and what came up was so laden with minerals that to other people it tasted like salt. To me, getting used to it, when I went to town, we'd go to Berlin, and I drank some of that water. It just didn't have any flavor. It was just awful. But that's not the big deal. It's washing clothes without water softeners and things. My poor mother, who had to wash without electricity. Remember, she did have a washing machine with a Briggs & Stratton motor that she used. Yeah, she used those for a lot of years. I have one of my memories of Strasbourg was my mother washing clothes with her brand new washing machine, which had a Briggs & Stratton motor on it. She was very proud of it. It also had a safety catch that you could hit and spring the ringers. She went out to hang up some clothes that she had just wrung, and I stuck my hand up into the wringer, my right arm, my right hand, and my arm got caught in the wringer. She came in just as the wringer is turning right here and hit that catch. The sewing machine she had, or the washing machine she had right before that, didn't have such an animal, so I would not be sitting here with two arms had it not been for that safety catch. But so we took me to the train station in Strasbourg, and we took me up to Linton, and that's where I was treated for whatever was wrong. I don't know that there was that much wrong with it. The arm always worked quite well. I got a shot for some reason, which I still have the scars from, but I don't know why. Tetanus? I'm not sure why you would get a shot when you get your arm caught in a wringer. But anyway, the safety catch on her washing machine that she just got just saved. All right, so back to the farm. My father would take us to school, and very often we had to walk home. 2.5 miles. That's really not that far when you think about it. It probably seemed further at the time, but and there were no hills, so it was not uphill either direction. It was straight flat. We often caught rides. We hitchhiked home, which when you think about that in today's environment, 3 kids out on the interstate or out on the highway hitchhiking home, and we got rides on a regular basis. But most of the time, my father would somehow figure out a way to break away and come pick us up. Let's see, anything else from the farm that is worth mentioning? Well, I think we can go to Lemoore if we want to, and Lemoore was fine. I was a bright enough kid and I was young enough that my classmates really didn't. They accepted me as one of their own, and I had a great uneventful time as a kid, except for working all the time. We had the store. We didn't have the store when we first got there, but we had the store, and my father and mother were quite eager for me to become part of the store process. This sign is always, I always think it's funny. The guy who painted it screwed up, so he put this comma in there to balance a little better. But I delivered groceries. I delivered groceries from the time we got the store. I was too young to drive, but this is Lemoore, and nobody cared. So after school, we delivered groceries twice a day, 10 o'clock and then 4 o'clock, and I'd take the 4 o'clock session. But my parents were eager for me to become a part of the store, and this was sort of a bribe for me to think that I belonged. I didn't get paid, so that didn't help. I always had another job to make money so I could go to college one day. And so when I finally went to college, I'd come home on weekends and I'd have to work. College was just wonderful. I went to school, and Saturday came. That was the busiest day in the store, and I could go to football games. I could do my studies. There was time for it. So I'd come home, and about Thanksgiving, my first year, I went to Jamestown. I came home, and they tried to talk me into quitting school and coming and taking over the store, and I stopped going home. But then I always had and this is really, it's not so much a Germans from Russia story. I think most of my generation, young guys and had jobs. It was harder for the girls to find jobs. But I always had, in fact, I would be farmed out to farmers whenever my father could break me away from the store to help out. I helped out in gas stations. I helped out in farms. I drove a gravel truck. I did whatever it took. And then I got my favorite job of all time. I became the first lifeguard at Lemoore. And I became the lifeguard at Lemoore because I could swim. And that was what it took. They needed me to be certified, so I went off to Wahpeton early June and got thrown into a lake that had just barely thawed, just ice cold, to become Red Cross certified. I had no idea what all these fancy things were, these strokes and everything that everybody had to do, and the rest of them were doing it, but I was a fairly decent swimmer, so I bluffed my way through and became the first lifeguard at Lemoore.
Can you tell me their names?
This is the banker's son. I use my assistant. These were just a couple of kids who would come to the beach, and some of them would scare the dickens out of me. You see this bicycle there? One day, I cleared the beach at the time to clear it, got everybody out, and people went home. And there was a bicycle there and some clothes, and the obvious, I lost one. And so I started diving in this black river looking for him, and I found nothing. And went home and waited, and nothing happened. And other times I'd go home and I'd get a call at 9 o'clock, you know, Jimmy went swimming this afternoon and he's not home yet. Did you see him leave? It was not good. The water, it was a river, and it flowed, and people were stupid, but it was a great job. Didn't have to lift anything, didn't have to serve people. I don't know what else to say about that part of it. That's, you know, I guess to be kind of, now it's boring then.
Well, I was just wondering if you
Oh,
wanted
the
to tell us
tractor.
about the tractor.
Oh, the tractor. Yeah. All right. This is a D John Deere tractor. Really nice paint and everything. The one my father bought back in the World War II era was not this attractive. It did have a steering knob that on it, and machinery was impossible to get, as most people would remember, and almost, well, more impossible than that was to find hired people. Everybody was either, any able-bodied person was in the service, or after the war doing something else. So you couldn't get machinery, you couldn't get tractors. Dad got this old D John Deere tractor, and he'd been using horses before. He had horse equipment, binders, and that sort of thing. So he cut the tongues off the horse-driven pulled machinery, and he put hitches on and hooked those things onto the tractor. And he would get on the binder, and he put me on the tractor, and this is what, I'm 7 years old going on 8. I'll be 8 in October when I'm starting to run this tractor, which was a fairly difficult machine to run. even for an adult. But for me, it was especially hard because in order for me to turn it, I'd have to stand, put both my hands on the knob, and turn. But when I was sitting, I sat so low that we were out in the field one day when one of our neighbors came driving across the field and stopped Dad, and then he started laughing, and he said, I saw you from the road, and I just wanted to see how you hooked up the tractor to the binder so you could run it from the binder. And of course, it's because I'm sitting down here, and you've seen pictures of me. I wasn't a very tall kid. But one of my sad stories, in a way, is he hooked this up to a header, and a header is a tricycle-like device with two wheels in the front and one in the back. The one in the back is the steering wheel, and a person stands on a little platform with a baseball-like device that you move back and forth to steer, and it just turns the vehicle. So my father, and the header also has it's a two-person operation. When it was pulled by horses, the person who stood in the wagon where the header put the heads of the grain ran the horses, operated the horses, and smoothed out the grain. Well, when he converted it to a tractor pull, it took a person in the box and somebody to run the tractor. I ran the tractor. And we had this field was really long. I could still see it, and this thing just chugged along so slowly. So I got to sit here and look at that fence that's down the road, down the field, and wait for it to get there so that I could turn and get us going in the other direction. And I got there in time, and as soon as I got to the point where I had to turn, I stood up and I started cranking 9 cranks to the left, hit the end of it, turn 9 cranks to the right to straighten it out again, and I looked back to see the header swinging like it was the end of a rope as you're playing, doing the skating or whatever. And there was my mother hanging on that baseball bat-like device for dear life. I almost whipped her off into the next county, and kind of a little. I didn't take the fence out or anything, but I almost took my mother out. But that's my D. John Deere tractor. I've got a hat that has a D. John Deere tractor on it. I've got calendars. I've got T-shirts. My wife does these things to me. She bought me this. But it's a memory of another era. I don't think we'd ever see the day where a kid who's 7 years old would be operating one of those. But that's the D. John Deere tractor. I was a little older. I'm trying to remember. I couldn't have been more than the 5th or 6th grade because we had the farm after we moved to town, and so we'd go out to the farm. But we were still using horses, and I wasn't very old because I was really short, and I went raking with the horses. And when I got done, I brought them to the barn and unhooked the chains that are hooked on the horses. Harnesses are hooked onto the rake with. And then you lead the horses away from the tongue, and the tongue slips out of this thing that's the yoke, and then you walk them into the barn. Well, I unhooked the chains, but I was too short to put the chains up onto the harness, so I just let them slide, and I pulled the horses off, and one of the chains got caught in a V on the right-hand side, and it pulled the rake in a way that the tongue went whipping and scared the horses, and they took off. And I'm in front of the rake because I got run over by the rake. I got into the rake ties, whatever they're called, and was there rolling until the tongue hit something and the back end flew up and I was let out. But nothing wrong. There was no harm. I don't know if I ever told anybody about that. I don't think I did. I don't think I told my parents, but I certainly I remember it well. I didn't do the horses a lot. We just didn't do that much with the horses. We got a little Ford tractor later that I ran, but by then I'm in junior high. You know, it's not that big a deal. Oh, but when I was in junior high, I lived a young kid's dream. Some guy decided he was going to build a ranch near Lemoore on the other side, the southern side, so we're heading on our way to Oaks. And he needed some ranch hands. And I got hired as a 7th grader as a ranch hand. And I had a horse, and I had a tractor, and I had a Jeep, a World War II Jeep. I was in my glory out there. And, my classmates got hired the next year. I was hired for 2 years, but it was lots of fun. Almost forgotten that I was a ranch hand once.